What happened at Abundant Life Christian School isn't just another tragic headline. This one cuts deeper. A 15-year-old girl, radicalized online by leftist ideologies, carried out a horrific attack targeting a Christian community. Again, it seems this is becoming a pattern, isn't it? A string of violence aimed at Catholic and Christian schools, and yet the left has the audacity to act like none of this is connected. They'll rush to exploit the tragedy to push their tired gun control rhetoric and demand we give up our freedoms, while conveniently ignoring the cultural rot they've used to fuel this chaos in the first place. Let's call it for what it is: a war on faith, a war on values, and a war on truth. This shooter wasn't just disturbed, she was steeped in a cocktail of leftist nihilism, radical feminism, Marxism, and an admiration for mass murderers. A girl who despised her own family, dehumanized her community, and decided to evolve by spreading destruction. It's sick, but what's sicker is that the same voices who enabled this mindset will now lecture you about how it's all your fault. They'll scream for gun bans, never mind that evil doesn't need a firearm to exist. They'll ignore the growing hostility toward faith and instead aim their outrage at the very freedoms that kept this country standing. It's never been more clear that we're not just fighting against violence, folks. We're fighting against an ideology that wants to dismantle everything good, decent, and sacred in this country. And if we don't wake up, they'll take it all. Now let's start by hearing from Madison's police chief, who gave this initial briefing after police secured the school.
Around 10:57 a.m., our officers were responding to a call of an active shooter at the Abundant Life Christian School here in Madison. When officers arrived, they found multiple victims suffering from gunshot wounds. We train on this almost quarterly. The last time we trained on this as commanders was approximately 2 weeks ago. The protocols are simple. Stop the killing, stop the dying, find out who's doing this. And the officers did that, and they did that adamantly. We had officers from around the county and around the state that came in support of this particular incident. Officers located a juvenile who they believe was responsible for this deceased in the building. Additionally, the officers began administering life-saving efforts to anyone who was wounded and making sure that those persons were transported. What we know is that a total of about 7 persons were transported from the scene to area hospitals for treatment. We know that at least 3 people have lost their lives, including a juvenile person.
To recap, here's where things stand. 3 lives have been tragically lost, including the shooter. 7 others were rushed to the hospital. We know the shooter was a 15-year-old female. We'll get more on that in a minute. Now, the motive, still unknown, though if history tells us anything, the truth will likely get buried beneath the layers of spin and narrative control. All that being said, President Biden has already been briefed, and the FBI and ATF were on the scene. But here's the part they don't want to talk about. While federal agencies swarm and politicians draft press releases, no one's asking how we got here, how schools became soft targets, and how our culture keeps breeding this level of brokenness. Instead, we'll get the usual political theater. Blame the tool, ignore the real issues, and leave communities to pick up the pieces. It's tired, it's predictable, and it realistically solves nothing. What we're witnessing here isn't just a tragedy, it's a symptom of a much deeper cultural and spiritual rot that's been eating away at society for decades. This isn't new. It's been festering since Columbine, a cultural sickness that glorifies death and turns mass murderers into twisted anti-heroes. This style of violence rears its head every few weeks or months, each time with more targeted political undertones. We've seen it over and over again. Killers who are inspired by other killers, drawn to the same macabre obsession with violence and destruction, as if each act of evil is somehow a torch to be passed. Take this latest shooter, for example. Reports show she admired and modeled herself after previous mass murderers, even idolizing monsters who left nothing but devastation in their wake. And yet, as the bodies pile up, we fail to address the cultural reasons this keeps happening. We never confront the cultural dysfunction that fuels these acts. Instead, we reward it with infamy, giving these killers the attention they crave while ignoring the root causes that create them in the first place. It all boils down to the glorification of killers and the twisted reactions that follow. And you have to look no further than last week, the case of Luigi Mangione, who brutally murdered the United Health Group CEO. Many on social media celebrated it. framing the violence as righteous anger against the insurance system, as though that somehow justifies cold-blooded murder. Meanwhile, legacy media treated it with ambivalence, carefully dancing around the story instead of offering a clear condemnation. Prominent leftists like Adam Conover and others echoed this justification, turning a brutal killing into a symbolic act of rebellion. Even typically reasonable voices like Bill Burr joked about it, normalizing what should be universally condemned. These responses don't just dismiss the horror, they inspire the next wave of violence. And this is how the cycle of violence grows. When murderers are framed as symbols of righteous causes, it plants a dangerous seed for those who are broken, disillusioned, and searching for meaning. It tells them that their destruction can be excused, even celebrated, if the anger feels justified by the mob. This is exactly what we see with the Abundant Life Christian school shooter, a teenage girl who idolized other mass murderers and adopted their blueprint for violence. Her motivations were twisted by a culture that glorifies death and destruction while demonizing faith, meaning, and order. And now, as attacks increasingly target Christian schools and communities of faith, the pattern becomes undeniable. Until we stop justifying evil, until we stop giving it a platform and treating violence as a form of righteous rebellion, this sickness will only spread and the tragedies will keep coming. Columbine lit the match, and since then it's spread like wildfire. We've traded faith, family, and purpose for moral decay, nihilism, and glorification of violence. And now we're seeing the disease mutate and take on political targets. Christian schools, symbols of faith, institutions that stand for something bigger than ourselves. This attack is just another chapter in a story that keeps getting darker. And yet the left's only answer is to strip away freedoms, disarm the innocent, and ignore the toxic culture that breeds these killers. Until we face the truth, we'll keep seeing the same evil repeat itself, only louder and more dangerous each time. And if you have any doubt of how far leftism has infiltrated our institutions, you have to look no further than the Madison police chief, who we just watched a few minutes ago. He said this at a later press conference.
We know that the suspect shooter was a teenage student who attended the school. At this time, we're not releasing the age or gender of the student or any other identifying remarks about the student.
It's not at all surprising that the police chief is refusing to release the shooter's gender. If the shooter had been a straight white male, his face, name, and entire life story would be already plastered across every news outlet in America. The media would be shouting about toxic masculinity, systemic violence, and gun culture. But because this shooter doesn't fit their narrative, because she's a teenage girl, the facts suddenly get withheld, and the story gets handled with kid gloves. We saw the same thing after the Nashville shooting, where the killer was a trans targeting a Christian school. The media avoided discussing the shooter's identity, and the Manifesto, critical to understanding the motive, was kept under wraps for months until it leaked. Now, why? Because it didn't support the preferred narrative. So here we go again. Selective transparency, carefully controlling what the public gets to know. When the facts challenge the narrative, they're buried. But when the killer fits the script, the outrage machine cranks into overdrive. People see this double standard, and we're tired of it. The truth shouldn't depend on whether the story is politically convenient or not. Anyway, this is the reasoning the police chief gave for not providing the shooter's gender.
Sure, there's nothing new that I can tell you about the shooter at this time. Again, as difficult as today is, that's still someone's child that's gone. That's still someone that has to deal with what happened today. And so we want to make sure that we can ensure as much cooperation as we can.
This strategy is absurd. It's evident that this selective lack of transparency when it comes to mass shooters is not just failing, it's actively making things worse. You've got police chiefs like this one in Madison standing there and saying, there's still someone's child that's gone, as if the rest of us are supposed to nod along and politely ignore the facts. Let me make this clear. When you pick up a gun and murder innocent people, innocent children, you're not just someone's child anymore, you're a killer, and you should be treated as such. This attempt to wrap these monsters in mystery isn't about protecting victims or stopping copycats. It's about protecting a political narrative. And let me tell you, it's not working. They claim that not releasing a shooter's name, gender, or manifesto helps prevent copycats. Sounds noble on paper, right? But the facts tell a different story. Despite these supposed efforts, school shootings in K-12 schools haven't decreased. In fact, incidents peaked at 349 in 2023, and as far as this year, we're already on pace for another record high year. So where's the evidence that this strategy works? There isn't any. Hiding their identities hasn't stopped these tragedies. If anything, the contagion effect, a well-documented phenomenon where one mass killing inspires another, has only grown worse. And here's the ugly truth. By turning these killers into shadowy figures and refusing to name and shame them, we're giving them exactly what they want. They don't want to go unnoticed. They want to be remembered. And when you deny the public an accurate understanding of who these people are and why they did what they did, you're not preventing copycats, you're fueling them. You're creating an allure. So weak, broken individuals see the secrecy, the mystique, and they think, that could be me. This has to stop. These killers don't deserve protection. They deserve to be dragged into the light and shamed for what they've done. Being a school shooter needs to be seen as the most disgraceful, pathetic thing imaginable. But instead, with this selective silence, law enforcement and the media are giving them an air of mystery. And mystery breeds allure. Yes, it's hard for the killer's family. There's no denying that. But shielding the killer doesn't bring back the victims, and it doesn't erase the shame of what their child did. Nothing can. What it does instead is muddle the truth and create a dangerous mystique around these monsters. These families will have to live with the reality of their child's actions. That's a tragedy in itself, but trying to protect the killer only adds fuel to this toxic cycle. What we can do is confront these killers for what they are, failures, not anti-heroes. We need to strip away the allure and status that this kind of violence creates for the weak and deranged. The more we tiptoe around these killers, refusing to name them, refusing to expose their motives, the more we make them look like something bigger than they are. That mystique becomes a magnet for others desperate for attention, desperate to leave a mark. Until we stop coddling these families and stop shielding these killers, the tragedies will keep coming and the cycle will only get darker. Anyway, Andy No reported more details on the shooter over on X. He says the deceased shooter has been identified as a 15-year-old girl named Natalie Lynn Rupnow. According to a source, Rupnow carried out the attack in a school library, and while speculation often arises in these cases, it's been confirmed she did not identify as trans. Rupnow used the name Sam online with the username Krozixer and had a disturbing, extensive obsession with school shooters and death, particularly the 1999 Columbine massacre. She idolized the Columbine killers and frequently wore a KMFDM band shirt, a group referenced by one of the Columbine shooters. Her online activity paints a clear picture. She wasn't just inspired by past mass murderers, she fixated on them. Friends online quickly identified her X account after the news broke, and chillingly, her final post, a photo of an OK hand symbol taken in the school's bathroom by the library, was made just minutes before she began the attack. Andy elaborates, sharing a sneak peek of Rupnow's Manifesto, which was reportedly shared on her Discord account, where she ranted about a desire to kill all males, a disturbing sentiment clearly inspired by fringe feminist and leftist extremist online culture. A screenshot of this manifesto, along with a mirror selfie photo of Rupnow, was posted to X by someone who had been on her Discord. Now, further exemplifying Rupnow's obsession with mass murderers, her Cash App account even featured a picture of the Columbine shooters, and she maintained an account on Watch People Die, where she would actively comment on violent videos. Her Spotify playlists, unsurprisingly, were filled with the themes of suicide and killings. The shooter's Tumblr account was also uncovered, and it featured more disturbing content about other mass shooters. Additionally, she posted about receiving a pistol as a birthday gift, further adding to the troubling timeline of her descent into violence. Ex-user Pagliacci the Hated also shared an in-depth thread regarding Rupnow. He made contact with the alleged boyfriend of the shooter, who provided a full manifesto. Pagliacci verified its authenticity by having the boyfriend screen record himself opening it from a direct link the shooter sent to him via WhatsApp. And here's what we know. Her boyfriend knew her as Samantha Rupnow. She also went by another feminine name, but adopted Samantha, which appeared on her school ID. She was a student at Abundant Life. She was born on November 7th, 2009. She was born female and was not transgender. Her boyfriend was also born male and is not transgender. That's likely in reference to rumors that the shooter was trans. Anyway, the shooter's manifesto was titled War Against Humanity. It's 6 pages long. In it, she speaks about an extremely difficult relationship with her parents, referring to them as scum. She claims her family didn't love her or want her, expressing a feeling of being the wrong child in her family. The shooter writes that she had planned to commit suicide long ago, but felt a shooting was, in her words, better for evolution rather than just one boring suicide. She expressed deep admiration for mass murderers, including Pekka Erik Ovinen, Arda Kuchuk-Yetim, and Vladislav Rusliakov. She offered particular praise for Kuchuk-Yetim, a Turkish neo-Nazi who carried out a mass attack earlier this year, calling him an ultimate saint. She admitted in the manifesto to obtaining the weapons through, as she puts it, lies, manipulations, and my my father's stupidity. Pagliacci also shared that her boyfriend provided context about a photo circulating online. He says the image doesn't represent how he remembers her and believes it was edited to make her look worse. He provided an alternate photo of her in the same t-shirt and room. Now, regarding the manifesto, unfortunately, I'm not entirely sure I can go into the whole thing without it triggering a TOS violation, but I will summarize it as best I can. The shooter's boyfriend, who had known her for 2 years, revealed they were in a long-distance relationship. They had never met in person and originally connected through social media. According to him, she had never previously expressed any desire to commit a shooting. In fact, she only sent him her manifesto the day of the attack. Now, the timestamps of the messages show that she sent the manifesto to him via WhatsApp at approximately 10:30 a.m. Eastern. She then posted it publicly to Twitter at 11:50 a.m. Eastern. The shooting itself happened just minutes later around 11:57 a.m. Eastern. The boyfriend didn't even see her message until 1:12 p.m. Eastern. By that time, the shooting had already occurred and she was deceased. When describing her, the boyfriend painted a very different picture of who she was behind the scenes. He described her as a kind, generous, and cheerful person, someone who always made him gifts and never expected anything in return. But on page 4 of her manifesto, Samantha reveals something far darker, stating that she acquired the weapons she used to commit the attack through, in her words, lies, manipulation, and her father's stupidity. The boyfriend admitted he knew there was a gun safe in her house, but didn't know how she got access to it. Now, in the final 2 pages of her manifesto, Rupnow delves into her personal struggles. She wrote about an extremely difficult relationship with her father, pointing out that her parents had divorced multiple times and that her mother struggled with drug addiction. She also implied that her father was an alcoholic. Her boyfriend emphasized that bullying at school was a significant factor in her life, and he believes it contributed heavily to her anger and deep pessimism about the world. Pagliacci confirmed that court records back up Rupnow's claims about her father, including the repeated divorces and the ongoing legal battles between her parents. Now, President Biden shared a statement expressing his condolences, calling the attack shocking and unconscionable. After offering thoughts and prayers for the victims, Biden pivoted to his usual call for stricter gun control, demanding Congress pass common sense measures like universal background checks, a national red flag law, and a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. He highlighted his administration's previous actions, including the most significant gun legislation in 30 years and the creation of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, while emphasizing that more is needed. Kamala Harris echoed similar sentiments, tying this tragedy to the 12th anniversary of Sandy Hook, which she referenced as a grim reminder of ongoing gun violence. She expressed mourning for the victims and gratitude to first responders, but used the same moment to repeat her call for legislative action. Harris pushed for universal background checks, red flag laws, safe storage laws, and an assault weapons ban, calling them common sense solutions to what she described as the leading cause of death for children in America. And like clockwork, they stand on the graves of victims to demand that you give up your freedoms. They don't pause to reflect on what led to this evil. They don't ask about how a 15-year-old girl became so twisted and broken. No, they pivot straight to their political playbook, using the grief and horror of a community as leverage to take away your rights. Biden and Kamala don't care about solving this problem. If they did, they'd be asking the hard questions about why we keep seeing this kind of violence. Instead, they act like passing another law stripping away more of your freedom will magically fix everything. It won't. Because here's the truth. The problem isn't the guns. The problem is the culture that creates these monsters. We live in a society that glorifies violence, nihilism, and destruction. We turn school shooters into dark anti-heroes, elevate their motives, and dissect their manifestos like they're worth studying. We let social media reward the deranged with attention and validation. We see the family unit collapse, faith vanish, and the moral order replaced with nothing but emptiness. That's the real sickness. Guns are just the tool, and if you take them away, the violence just won't stop. Just look at Luigi Mangione. He didn't even buy a gun. He 3D printed one. Would a gun ban have stopped him? No. Because if someone is determined to commit violence, they'll find a way. Whether it's 3D printed guns, knives, homemade bombs, or cars driven into crowds, evil doesn't disappear just because you outlaw a weapon. The focus on guns is a distraction, an easy scapegoat for politicians who don't want to address the deeper issue, the moral and spiritual decay that has taken hold of our culture. And that's what we need to face. This tragedy in Madison didn't happen in a vacuum. A 15-year-old girl became so consumed by hatred, violence, and and death that she murdered innocent children. And she's not the first. She idolized past killers because society keeps turning them into legends. She was bullied, isolated, and angry. And the culture gave her a blueprint to channel that rage into destruction. Until we address this decay, until we start rebuilding families' faith and values, this problem won't end. You can ban every gun in existence, but the violence will remain. The broken will find other ways to destroy, and the bodies will still pile up. The solution isn't to strip away freedom. It's to confront the sickness of our culture. It's to call evil for what it is, shame those who commit these atrocities, and stop handing them an air of mystique and power. We need to restore purpose, meaning, and moral clarity before more children are lost, not to guns, but to the darkness we refuse to face. We also need to talk about something no one wants to acknowledge: the normalization of violence against Christians and the targeted nature of these attacks on Christian schools. This isn't random, it's deliberate. It's the result of a culture fueled by leftist and Marxist ideologies that openly mocks faith, vilifies Christianity, and works to tear down the core values this country was built on. These shootings are more than senseless violence. They are symbolic strikes at the foundations of our nation. The left has declared a war on faith, and it's more transparent than ever. They are subverting the minds of the young, pushing them into nihilism, radicalizing them against morality, purpose, and truth. When a 15-year-old girl walks into a Christian school to murder innocent children, that's not just a tragedy. It's the clearest sign yet of an assault on what this country stands for. Until we address this war on faith head on, until we stop allowing these ideologies to poison our children and turn them into agents of chaos, this cycle of destruction will only grow. So I'll leave you with this. How much longer are we going to let this sickness spread? How many more lives have to be lost before we start asking the hard questions about the culture that breeds these killers, the families that fail them, and the moral emptiness that fills our minds? How much longer will we ignore the growing pattern of violence targeting Christian schools and communities of faith, attacks that strike at the very moral and spiritual foundations of this country? Are we really going to let politicians strip away our freedoms while refusing to address the war on faith that fuels this decay? Do we honestly believe that banning guns will stop violence when we're already seeing people 3D print their weapons or find other tools to carry out destruction? Or are we finally ready to face the truth that this isn't a gun problem, it's a culture problem, a spiritual crisis born from a society that has abandoned faith, morality, and purpose? Until we confront that, nothing will change. So I ask you, what kind of society do we want to build? And how long are we going to pretend this decay, this war on truth and faith, doesn't exist? You tell me in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.